Chapter 7. Our small community remained in perfect harmony for many months, until, unfortunately, a young man about 20 years of age, belonging to another tribe, arrived. This youth was taken seriously ill a few days after joining us, and although we did all we could for him, he died. This event created great distress, and by way of changing the scene, our small party broke up and left the Carafe on a short hunting excursion. After a time, we fell in with the deceased young man's family, who, on being informed of his death, expressed great astonishment and rage, fancying it had been brought about by some unfair means on our part. This excitement arose to such a height as to approach what it would be mercy to describe insanity. After a time, they forced the poor blind boy away from me and killed him on the spot, because he had happened to be in the same hut in which the young man died, believing he had been in some way the means of his death. After this, they roasted the body in the usual manner. But whilst this was going on, I left with the little girl, moving on until meeting the tribe to which the man belonged to whom in her infancy she had been promised. I explained all the particulars of the sacrifice of her poor blind brother. They immediately vowed vengeance, and 2 or 3 of them set out for the purpose of murder, returning in a few days with the intelligence that they had killed 2 of the children of their enemies. By one accession and the other, our numbers had now increased to more than 200 men, women, and children, and it may be easily supposed that such a mob of savages could not move on long without fights and bloodshed. Seeing these things certain, I left with the proposed husband of the little girl and 1 or 2 families to go back again to the Carafe River. Having remained there some time, I resolved on Sir rendering my charge to her intended husband, and the wife he had had with him for many months, and positively insisted on doing so, although they were anxious that she should remain with me for some time longer. Having transferred her to the care of these people, I set off alone, determined to live by myself, in order to avoid a repetition of the scenes I had witnessed, and all farther intercourse with the natives. The direction I took was along the sea coast. But although subsisting upon shellfish principally, I now knew perfectly well how to provide myself with a change of food and with fire to cook it, so as to make whatever it was more palatable. Although I had parted with the girl from prudential motives, I lamented very bitterly the savage death of her brother, my poor blind boy, for whom I had acquired a great affection, and who on his part had so many 100 times clung to me for shelter and protection. I was now again very lonely and miserable, and whilst indulging in melancholy thoughts one day, such as cannot be described, I was most unexpectedly joined by a young native woman, who had ran away from her tribe at some distance, where it was fighting with another. She remained with me for a long time, during which I was successful in procuring abundance of food. Amongst other kinds was a large sea animal, one of that sort which the natives call the corman, mentioned before as having visited my retreat near where I first met the natives. We found the flesh very good eating, and my female friend enjoyed the repast with great gusto, greasing herself all over with the fat after we had made the most of the carcass, which might well be compared to bacon. My amiable young lady friend continued with me for a long time. In fact, she made all sorts of excuses for not going back to her tribe, who, not coming in search of her and we not knowing of their whereabouts, were induced at length to remove for a change of hunting and fishing grounds. Arriving ultimately at Danawa, where there is a considerable river, having its source in several high mountains, some way off in the interior. The scrub through which we should have had to pass, had we left the beach, being almost impassable, we were obliged to keep along the seashore. And the weather by this time being cold and inclement, we occasionally took shelter and slept in the caves and crevices of the rocks. This was a very suffering time, and as soon as we could, we returned again to my old fishing castle on the Carafe. The reader may wonder how it was possible for anyone like myself, who had, in my earlier life, been associated with civilized beings, so to live. But I beg him to remember how many years I had led a different sort of existence, and how easy it is for the human being, as well as every other, to change his habits, taste, and I may add, feelings, when made the mere creature of circumstances. I look back now to that period of my life with inexpressible astonishment, considering it, as it were, altogether a dreaming delusion and not reality. Perhaps there is no one living who can cast his mind back to so many years of his past life, with such a multiplicity of extraordinary sensations as have fallen to my lot to experience. After many months, we were visited by my companion's relatives, to whom she returned, and I was left once more alone. Occasionally, however, visiting such of the friendly tribes as came to my locality. All the years I had been upon the coast, and near it I had never seen or heard of any ship, or of shipwrecked mariners, so that I had no hope afforded now of ever again regaining an association with civilized beings. I had seen a race of children grow up into women and men, and many of the old people die away, and by my harmless and peaceable manner amongst them, had acquired great influence in settling their disputes. Numbers of murderous fights I had prevented by my interference, which was received by them as well meant. So much so that they would often allow me to go amongst them previous to a battle and take away their spears and waddies and boomerangs. My visits were always welcomed, and they kindly and often supplied me with a portion of the provisions they had, assuring me, in their language, of the interest they took in my welfare. Here I may as well say that the native language varies according to the tribe individuals belong to, each tribe having a peculiar expression of their own. The one I was with so many years, I of course understood perfectly, but there were others I could scarcely make out. I saw a native from the Murray River whose language was perfectly unintelligible to all of us. Indeed, this is reasonable when we reflect on the difference of the dialect or pronunciation of words of many of the counties of England, Ireland, and Scotland. How careful then ought those persons to be, who are now known as what are called protectors of Aborigines, when they attempt to interpret on trials in courts of justice. Their translations and explanations should be received with great care, in order to prevent the infliction of unjust punishments, especially in cases of life and death. Again, there is another point to be borne in mind, that is, the vindictive character of the natives, which leads them, in many instances, to give evidence founded upon revenge and falsehood. This is all very bad, but that it is true cannot be doubted. I had almost forgotten to say that in my wanderings about, I met with the Palliderg Barons, a tribe notorious for their cannibal practices, not only eating human flesh greedily after a fight, but on all occasions when it was possible. They appeared to be the nearest approach to the brute creation of any I had ever seen or heard of, and, in consequence, they were very much dreaded. Their colour was light copper, their bodies having tremendously large and protruding bellies. Huts, or artificial places for shelter, were unknown to them, it being their custom to lay about in the scrub, anyhow and anywhere. The women appeared to be most unnaturally ferocious, children being their most valued sacrifice. Their brutality at length became so harassing and their assaults so frequent that it was resolved to set fire to the bush where they had sheltered themselves, and so annihilate them, one and all, by suffocation. This in part succeeded, for I saw no more of them in my time. The belief is that the last of the race was turned into a stone or rock at a place where a figure was found resembling a man and exceedingly well executed, probably the figurehead of some unfortunate ship. One day when I was at Bangabara, some distance in the interior, I saw some natives coming along, one of them carrying a flag over his shoulders. On anxious inquiry, I was told by them that they had seen a vessel laying at anchor in Port Phillip Bay and near Indented Heads. Watching her for several days, they observed her removed to another anchorage, soon after which a boat was hoisted out and all hands left her, proceeding up the river. After watching several hours to see the coast clear, 3 of them swam alongside and hoisted themselves on board, one way and another. The first object that attracted their attention was the colours. These they soon hauled down. Then they purloined rope, sails, and other things they thought would prove serviceable, such as glass bottles to bark and sharpen their spears with. There were many other articles they took, but fortunately they were afraid to go down into the cabin, and so considerable property was saved from plunder. Having completed their marauding excursion, they carried what they had to land and far back into the bush. When the crew returned and saw the mischief done during their absence, they fired off their pieces. but they were at too great a distance to do any injury to the natives. Thinking it advisable, they soon got the anchor up again, moving farther out into the bay. This was the story they related, and great anxiety was expressed that I should lend a hand to decoy the people on shore so as to get them into our power, with the vessel, boats, and cargo also. I did all possible to divert their attention, telling them that if they went to where the ship was, they would again be fired upon and all killed. A few days after, I saw the vessel still laying at anchor, and became almost nervously wild with desire to make myself known to those on board, so as at length to be released from captivity. And with that hope I went alone, taking with me merely my spears and other instruments for hunting and fishing. When I got to the beach abreast of the vessel, I made a large fire, thinking I should attract their attention, as several persons could be seen walking up and down the deck, occasionally looking attentively toward me, as I thought. All my efforts, however, were useless, the crew no doubt supposing, after the robbery on board by the natives, that the object was to entice them on shore for some murderous or mischievous purpose. I could not hail them, having lost all my English language. All that day and night I continued making signals, my heart ready to break with grief and anxiety, seeing all my efforts futile. About the middle of the next day, a boat put off from the side, coming in my direction, and, when distant only half a mile, my signals were repeated. But alas, when only 300 yards off, the people in her hoisted sail, steering away 2 or 3 miles farther up the beach toward a small island where they landed. Seeing this to be a chance opening up for me, I followed as fast as I could run, and crossed over to where I supposed they were cutting wood. However, the breeze being in their favour before I could reach the spot, they had cut as much as they wanted, put it into the boat, and shoved off, only laughing at my violent gesticulations and unintelligible cries. Little thinking who I was, or that I was any other than I appeared to be in my native dress. Forgetting all this, I reproached them to myself very bitterly, thinking them worse than savages, thus to leave me in my misery. Instead of their having been guilty of inhumanity, I should have remembered the possibility and probability of their firing upon me, and particularly after the act of robbery before mentioned. After consoling myself somewhat, I examined the spot where they had been, thinking to find perhaps a hatchet or some such like tool which would prove useful. In looking about, I saw a mound of earth about the size of a grave, but I foolishly thought it might be a place of concealment for some kind of treasure, and, although money or plate or jewels could not have been of the least use to me in my disconsolate condition, yet I determined to examine the mound, and began to do so by taking off the turfs with which it was covered. Having worked some time, I was shocked at coming to the body of a white man, wrapped up in a blanket. It occurred to me to remove this covering, as the weather was very cold, and it seemed a pity to leave so good an article where it was, but I couldn't find it in my heart to rob the dead, even to supply my own pressing necessities. I therefore made the grave up again, covering it carefully over with boughs and heavy stones so to protect the body from the wild dogs. Finding all my efforts to communicate with the ship useless, and after passing another night in great distress, I made my way back to the tribe. The vessel remained where she was for several days longer, a period to me of indescribable misery. What the ship was, or where she was bound to, or where from, I was never able to make out, in consequence of my ignorance of dates. During the period we were watching her, the natives told me another vessel had anchored nearly in the same place, a long time previous, from which vessel 2 white men were brought ashore by 4 or 5 others, who tied them to trees and shot them, leaving their bodies bound. A few months after these efforts of mine to communicate with the ship, I found a large boat stranded on the beach. It appeared to have belonged to a whaler, as there were 8 large oars laying about her, partly buried in the sand. There were also 3 blankets rigged as a sail, with ropes, mast, and other articles, used by some unfortunate mariners who had been cast away. The blankets, after being washed, I spread over the boat to dry, and when that was done, a fire was visible at some distance, to which I went, and there found a party of natives cooking and eating fish and other food. On seeing the blankets, they began capering about in their usual fantastic manner, expressing the most extravagant joy. Acting on prudential motives, and in order to preserve harmony, I cut the blankets up into several pieces, dividing them as I best could. This done, we returned to the wrecked boat, which they had evidently seen or known about before. Indeed, they soon told me that a few days previous, 2 white men had wandered from the beach into the bush where these natives were, who received them kindly. The poor fellows were dreadfully bruised and cold, in fact, perishing from exposure, thirst, and hunger. They pointed in the direction where I had found the boat, as if trying to make the tribe understand that some accident had happened, looking at the same time very sad and disconsolate. Being well fed on fish and kangaroo, after some days they recovered their strength. The natives then tried to make them understand there was a white man, meaning myself, amongst them, and that they would go in search of me. But the poor fellows could not be made to comprehend their meaning, and went away by themselves toward the Yawang Plains. There is no doubt, but they were part of the people cast ashore in the boat. Some months after, I heard that the same 2 men who had been so kindly treated were savagely murdered whilst crossing the Yarra River by a tribe called the Werewayu. I grieved very much at this melancholy event, for had I arrived in time, no doubt their lives would have been preserved. And on the circumstance I reflected very seriously, expressing my heartfelt thanks to the great Creator of my being for having brought me unharmed through so many dangers. Several months after, when journeying alone along the beach, I found a large cask, a barrel or hogshead, partly buried in the sand, which no doubt had been thrown on shore from a wrecked ship. It was much too heavy for me to lift or move in any way, so I set to work digging round about it, until I could get at the iron hoops which I knew were valuable to the natives. At length I knocked the head in, but could not fancy what the liquid contents were, having lived so long in the bush without tasting any other drink than water. The flavour appeared to be horribly offensive, and the smell equally so. It must have been either beer or wine, not being strong enough for spirits. However, I determined on letting the whole contents go by the run to prevent mischief, should the natives take a fancy to it, although so utterly nauseous to my palate. Having broken up the iron hoops into pieces, I some days after divided them amongst those who were most kind to me, and by these presents added greatly to the influence I had already acquired over them. Whether being so long with them was the occasion or not, but I began to fancy they were gradually becoming more docile and civilized. The various families returned to their several camping places, except one old man, his wife and children, who remained, and we proceeded together to a lake called Geringot, one of a chain of that name, which supplies the Barwon River. Here the bunyip, the extraordinary animal I have already mentioned, were often seen by the natives, who had a great dread of them, believing them to have some supernatural power over human beings so as to occasion death, sickness, disease, and such like misfortunes. They have also a superstitious notion that the great abundance of eels in some of the lagoons where these animals resort are ordered for the bunyip's provision, and they therefore seldom remain long in such neighbourhoods after having seen the creature. They told me a story of a woman having been killed by one of them, stating that it happened in this way. A particular family one day was surprised at the great quantity of eels they caught, for as fast as the husband could carry them back to their hut, the woman pulled them out of the lagoon. This, they said, was a cunning manoeuvre of a bunyip to lull her into security, so that in her husband's absence he might seize her for food. However, this was after the husband had stayed away some time. He returned, but his wife was gone, and she was never seen after. So great is the dread the natives have of these creatures, that on discovering one, they throw themselves flat on their faces, muttering some gibberish, or flee away from the borders of the lake or river, as if pursued by a wild beast. When alone, I several times attempted to spear a bunyip, but, had the natives seen me do so, it would have caused great displeasure. And again, if I had succeeded in killing, or even wounding one, my own life would probably have paid the forfeit, they considering the animal, as I have already said, something supernatural. End of chapter 7.